I think one of the biggest problems we have right now is just how little people know about human trafficking. So if you don't know what to look for, you're never going to see it, even if it's right in front of you.
Welcome back to Closer Look with Michael Friscolanti, our editor-in-chief. Here at Village Media, I'm Scott Sexsmith. Derek Turner, as always, at the helm. CloserLookPodcast.ca is our website. If you haven't already, please do so. Check it out. And Closer Look at villagemedia.ca. Any comments or questions you may have about the program. Good to see you tonight. We talk about a lot of serious things on this program. And tonight certainly is no exception.
Yes, you're right. There's some new data that's come out over the last few weeks. First, by an organization called the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking. They released some new data on the number of people that are calling their hotline and how the numbers have really risen in the last few years. A couple of weeks later, Statistics Canada came out with their own report about just the scale of human trafficking in Canada. And what they measured were the number of police-reported cases of human trafficking. And they're way up. And Ontario is leading the way. So there's a big increase in Ontario as well, including for reasons we're going to discuss today. It's the city of Guelph is number one in Ontario in terms of reported human trafficking. Now, we all know that a lot of this has to do with the fact that a lot of cases of human trafficking don't go reported. The victims never come forward. They're never able to come forward. We're going to talk about all those kind of things. So we have a great expert coming on today. She's the executive director of the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking, and she's going to help us understand what's behind these numbers, what they really mean, and really most importantly, what can be done to help bring the numbers down.
New data released this week sheds more light on the alarming scale of human trafficking in this country, especially here in Ontario. The StatsCan analysis comes on the heels of another eye-opening report from the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking, which revealed that calls to its hotline are at an all-time high. Joining us tonight on the program to talk more about this important issue is the Centre's Executive Director, Julia Drydyk. Julia, thanks so much for taking the time. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, before we get into the specifics, Julia, tell us a bit about your organization and its mission.
Yes, the Centre was founded in 2016 with what I'm told is the incredibly bold mandate of actually ending all forms of human trafficking in Canada. So while most people are becoming more familiar with sex trafficking, we're also finding that labor trafficking is far too prevalent across Canada. So we do this in a couple different ways. One is in operating the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline, and that's the source of some of the data of the most recent report we did. But we also do education, awareness, convening, knowledge building, advocacy, and public policy work.
All right. Thank you for that explanation. Okay, your organization recently released some data that I want to talk about. But before we do, let's talk about the StatsCan numbers that were reported this week. They looked at human trafficking data from 2014 to 2024 nationally and found during that 10-year span there were over 5,000 incidents reported by police. I assume that number did not surprise you?
No, and that's only really the tip of the iceberg. Interestingly enough, the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline is actually identifying a similar number of survivors every year when you look at all police-reported data. But less than 10% of those people contacting the hotline are actually in a place of readiness to engage with law enforcement. So we actually feel like those numbers add to each other and that there's probably not a lot of duplication in what it is that we're identifying.
That's a great point. In terms of the national average, Ontario was quite higher than the national average at 2.3 incidents per 100,000. Can you speak a little bit to why in Ontario it's a little more prevalent or a lot more prevalent than in other places?
There's a whole bunch of factors behind that. And part of it is that Ontario just has the highest population density when it comes to other provinces. So we know that trafficking, and especially sex trafficking, is about profit. And it's about connecting to those commercial sex markets. And basically where you've got a city or an urban center, you've got a commercial sex market. But we've also seen the highest per capita investments in human trafficking awareness, prevention, and detection in Ontario compared to any other province. So they really are setting the standard in terms of prioritizing it, making sure there's a robust strategy in place, and putting dollars behind, again, that awareness and education. Because I think one of the biggest problems we have right now is just how little people know about human trafficking. So if you don't know what to look for, you're never going to see it, even if it's right in front of you.
It's a great point. Help us understand that. People have their assumptions about what human trafficking is. What is it? How does it happen? How do so many people fall victim to it?
Unlike what you see in the movies, human trafficking rarely involves kidnapping or smuggling across borders. When it comes to sex trafficking in Canada, overwhelmingly, survivors are Canadian women and girls. And it looks far more like intimate partner violence than kidnapping or abduction. Labor trafficking, on the other hand, manifests very differently. So we're seeing that it's kind of endemic to our temporary foreign worker system. And while migrants are coming here legally on legal work visas, because they're tied to one employer, have access to fewer labor rights and other access to services, we're finding that that's laying the foundation for this kind of systematic abuse and exploitation.
Julia, who's doing the trafficking? Is it organized crime? Is it one-offs? What's the story?
That's a great question. And I think when I did research on human trafficking corridors in Canada in 2019 and 2020, and we know that there's a relationship with organized crime, but it's not manifesting in the same kind of hierarchy of organized crime, which makes it even harder to detect. So traffickers are often positioning themselves as a boyfriend, a friend, someone that the victim actually knows, loves, and trusts. And they're finding different ways to launder the money, usually more individually, also sometimes putting debts and other expenses in the name of the victim to avoid detection. So we know there's a link there. We know that traffickers often have a relationship with organized crime, but we're not necessarily seeing human trafficking as a business model operating through the more kind of traditional organized crime methods.
It's a great. I appreciate you pointing that out, because a lot of people they assume a lot of things about this topic, but one thing they would assume or they would not assume is that it can begin with a regular relationship. This could be your boyfriend, it could be someone a close relative, and then all of a sudden you go down that pit. Is that accurate?
That is the vast majority of what we see in operating the hotline, and the Stats Can data also speaks to this. That I think it's over 30% of police identified victims. The trafficker is someone that's positioned as an intimate partner, but it's also a family member, a friend.
Yes.
It's kind of a grooming process.
It is. Traffickers are systematic and looking for people with vulnerabilities in their lives. And that could really be anything. So it can mean something as common as low self-esteem, problems in your peer group, problems at home. But they're also intentionally looking for folks who might be living in poverty, experiencing housing insecurity. Maybe they've got mental health or addictions issues. And so they hone in on that. And there's usually a period of love bombing. So they find out someone's greatest dreams and aspirations, but also their biggest fears. They will shower them with everything they've ever wanted. And really kind of sell them a future and a world together that they never thought they would get. But then they quickly start kind of pulling that back, while also pushing their sexual boundaries and grooming them into the commercial sex industry. So there's a real gross use of emotional control, deceit, and coercion. So they're trying to get the survivors to actually think that they consented to something that they didn't. And that's part of what's used to keep folks entrapped.
What's amazing to hear amidst all that, the way you describe it, is that there's this wonderful hotline that you guys operate where people have this resource that they can call. And then, like you said in your latest data, over 5,100 calls last year to this hotline. It's an amazing thing. I can imagine just watching those people work and listening to their stories and listening to what happened. Just must be a very powerful thing to witness.
It's hard doing this work. It's a lot of hard work, and we're kind of dealing with some of the most gross experiences of people being horrible people. But I have to say that my team is what drives me to do this work, and just their commitment, their passion, their resilience, and them creating the space also for survivors to take those steps for themselves. We often say we can't save survivors. Survivors are saving themselves. We're just there to give them access to the support and resources that they need to take on that journey.
And I assume that journey can be long sometimes, maybe multiple calls to the hotline. What kind of steps do you do to help someone who wants to try to break free of this?
So it really depends case by case. Whenever you call the hotline, and anyone can call, it doesn't have to be an emergency situation. It could also just be to talk through a situation. But we do a safety assessment at the very first, at the beginning. So we assess whether or not they're safe. And if they aren't safe, then we work with them in a safety plan. So that could be either getting physically out of the situation they're in. It could be connecting with law enforcement or with another service provider. But we have partnerships with over 1,000 frontline service delivery partners across the country, as well as 99 specialized law enforcement units. So while the world isn't perfect, there's not services available in every community, we do our very best to make sure that people get the support they need when they want it, no matter where they are.
Julia, some people say, you know what, this doesn't concern me. Human trafficking doesn't impact me. What do you say to those people?
It might not. And you know what? I would love a world where it doesn't impact anyone. But unfortunately, the more education and awareness we do, the more disclosures that come forward. And we hear this across the board. So Ontario has also mandated some level of human trafficking awareness in all public school boards. We hear this from training providers and other folks that are raising awareness. It is rare that you go and do an information session and not get an actual disclosure of someone who's either being trafficked or groomed or another type of just really dangerous or unhealthy relationship.
When you do talk about awareness, if someone's listening to this show today, maybe a teenager's listening to this show, what should they be looking for among their peer group or signs of friends or family?
And this is a great question because we actually think that peers are some of the greatest tools to be part of change. If something's going on with a young person, it's actually probably not the parents that are going to know first. It's their best friends. So usually there's someone new in their life. So it might be a new boyfriend or a love interest. It might also be a new group of friends. And you're going to see them withdrawing from their normal social circles. It's never just one sign, but again, it lines up with signs of an unhealthy relationship. So if someone is new in their life, they're showing a lot of control. They might be providing canned answers, not being really honest about where they're going, what they're doing, maybe not showing up to school or events as much. They might also have really expensive new things that just don't add up when it comes to their income sources. And then, unfortunately, you're also seeing other signs of abuse. So cuts and bruises. Again, it really does line up with intimate partner violence. I think one of the additional challenges we see, though, is that there's so much stigma when it comes to engagement with the commercial sex industry. So in our research on human trafficking corridors, I asked service providers, what are some of the biggest challenges for people getting help? And they said stigma. Stigma was the number one thing that kept them from reaching out for support. And that's being used by traffickers too. They're leveraging that to keep them isolated and telling them things like, no one will ever love you again. Who's going to trust you?
Julia, let's talk political involvement for a sec if we can. If any politicians are listening or watching tonight, what more needs to be done? What's your message to them?
So at a federal level, I think everyone in the anti-human trafficking sector is waiting on bated breath for the renewal of the federal anti-human trafficking strategy. And we'd like to see that be more intentional around prevention. But we also at the provincial level need to make sure that every province has an anti-human trafficking strategy in place that will be renewed in perpetuity until we achieve our mission of eradicating human trafficking. And it's actually well-resourced. We can't just do this off the side of our desks. We need to make sure there's intentional resources available across the social services sector. And we see this too. Traffickers are really good at avoiding detection. And so if there's an area where there aren't targeted investments around education awareness, where there aren't intentional law enforcement units, they go to those places where they're not going to be detected so they can, avoid any trouble.
I do want to go back into some of the details of the previous reports, and we appreciate again all your time, Julia. What struck me too, StatsCan lists the cities that had the most police reported incidents, and I think Guelph topped the list in Ontario. Would that be because it's more rampant in Guelph, or because the people are reporting it more to police?
It lines up also with our data, just in terms of we are also seeing that small rural communities and hamlets are reaching out to us. And the total number is lower, but when you look at it in relation to the population density, it's actually an overrepresentation. Again, we're also seeing significant investments in anti-trafficking work in Ontario. And Ontario is one of the few provincial jurisdictions that have interjurisdictional law enforcement units that actually communicate, collaborate, share case data so that when traffickers leave a municipal area, they're not having to start from scratch in terms of their investigations. But we also know that the 401 corridor is a major human trafficking corridor across Canada. The traffickers are systematically kind of going, even starting as much as in Montreal, and then going city to city across the 401, even up until Windsor, kind of tapping into those commercial sex markets, but also avoiding law enforcement detection and keeping victims isolated and dependent on them.
I think we touched on this a little bit before, but is it somewhat of a good news story that we're seeing the more police reported case? We're seeing even the fact that more people are calling your hotline means the awareness is out there. Is that accurate to say?
I think so. And it sounds weird talking about it like a good news story, but unfortunately, this has been going on for decades. And folks doing this work have been seeing it for decades. Trends change here and there, but I really do think that the increase in numbers is a reflection of the power of education and awareness. And I think our theory of change is we need to get to a point of saturation where 90% of Canadians actually know what human trafficking is. Then we're going to understand what the baseline is, and then we can start figuring out what works to get those numbers down until eventually there is no more human trafficking in Canada.
And from a prosecution perspective, I'm assuming it's very difficult to prosecute a case. For one, they're not reported very often, but when they are reported, it's quite the process to do that. Is that why we just don't see a lot of prosecutions?
It's really challenging with our criminal code definition on human trafficking because it's almost entirely reliant on victim testimony, and it's an incredibly re-traumatizing and challenging experience. We also know that the average length of a trial is over twice that of any other major violent crime. And we're also seeing just really low prosecution rates. And so for good reasons, survivors are often saying, this is not in my best interest to keep going. And we're seeing this also in terms of charges around sexual assault and sexual-based violence. The ombudsperson for victims of crime came out with a report recently talking about how reforms to the Jordan Principle would make a really big difference in being able to execute better access to justice for survivors. So I think there's a lot that we need to do in terms of structural reform so that our judicial systems are actually serving survivors. I'd say right now, unfortunately, even though there's some good new efforts, we're really failing people.
Important conversation tonight, Julia. Anything that we didn't cover that we should have? Just
for the listeners, if something feels off in your gut or if you want to know more, please don't hesitate to call the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-833-900-1010. The prevention calls are just as important as also responding to people in these horrible situations.
All right. And we will flash that number on the screen and put it in the write-up so people have it handy. There's Julia Drydyk, the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking. Julia, good to see you. We appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you so much.
You know, it's interesting sitting here listening to Julia speak. And 20 years ago, human trafficking was not something that you heard about, talked about.
No, it's my assumption, but I bet if we went and did a search through the news archives, we wouldn't see a lot of that term wouldn't be something you'd hear a lot of, right? And it's interesting because when I read about this in the news yesterday, the numbers are so stark and alarming, right? More 5,000 police reported cases over the last decade, according to Stats Canada.
Yeah.
And then you see they've had 5,000 calls to their hotline alone just last year. And the numbers are overwhelming, but the way she explains it, it's true. There is a good news story there, right? It means that people are coming forward. It means that people are more aware that there are resources out there for them to get help. So I think it's why I enjoy so much having these conversations. Not that that's a fun topic to talk about, but people are going to learn a lot. I learned a lot listening to Julia tonight, and hopefully that our listeners and our viewers do too.
All right. Coming up tomorrow night on the program, the legendary Joe Bowen.
Joe Bowen.
In his last season calling Toronto Maple Leaf hockey games on radio. 7 o'clock tomorrow night. That'll be good.
I think that's going to be the podcast episode you don't want to watch. You want to listen to that one because it'll make you feel more at home with Joe Bowen.
And don't think for a second we're not going to get him to say his catchphrase. It's going to happen.
I have some ideas. We'll see.
All right. Good stuff. Closerlookpodcast.ca is our website. Reach out anytime. Closer look at villagemedia.ca. Derek Turner, producer of this evening's program, as always, for Michael Friscolanti, our editor-in-chief. I'm Scott Sexsmith. We appreciate your time this evening. Let's do it again tomorrow night at 7 with Joe Bowen. Holy Mackinac, right here on Closer Look.
Frisco and Scott's Wardrobe provided in part by Moores, Sault Ste. Marie.